Delete those messages before he wakes up. I heard it the way you hear something underwater, muffled, delayed, arriving a half second after it should have. My name is Ethan Marsh, and at the time I heard my wife whisper those 11 words into a phone at 2 in the morning, I was 43 years old, a history teacher who had spent 2 decades explaining to 16-year-olds how empires collapse from the inside before anyone outside notices. I taught it every year. I never once thought to apply it to myself. Rachel was standing in the doorway of our bathroom, backlit by the small blue glow of her phone screen, her voice pitched so low I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it. I hadn't. I lay there with my eyes closed, doing the thing I would come to recognize, months later, as the first of many small betrayals I committed against myself. I pretended to be asleep. We'd been married long enough that the exact number of years had stopped mattering the way it once did. It wasn't a countdown anymore, it was just weather, the climate we lived in. 2 kids, Sophie, 16, sharp-tongued and watchful in a way that unsettled me sometimes, and Owen, 14, still soft at the edges, still believing the world was mostly kind. Rachel had become academic dean at Ashford Prep 3 years earlier, a promotion she'd earned and that had, almost overnight, swallowed something in her that used to come home at 6 and ask about my day. I didn't ask who was on the other end of that call. That's the part one have to say out loud now, because for a long time I told myself I simply hadn't heard clearly enough to ask. I had heard clearly enough. I just didn't want the answer badly enough to risk getting one. The next morning she was already dressed by the time I came downstairs, moving through the kitchen with the brisk, overbright efficiency of someone auditioning for the role of a woman with nothing on her mind. She kissed me on the cheek, not the mouth, I noted that even then, filed it away without naming it, and said something about an accreditation walkthrough at school that would keep her late. Late? How late? I asked, pouring coffee I didn't taste. 9, maybe 10. She didn't look up from her phone. Don't wait up. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever stood in your own kitchen holding a mug of coffee you can't taste, watching someone you've shared a bed with for years type a message with her thumb angled just slightly away from you, you already know the specific, quiet ache of that moment. It isn't suspicion yet. It's smaller than that. It's just a splinter you tell yourself you'll deal with later. I said, sure, and let her go. That evening I sat at the kitchen table grading essays on the fall of the Roman Republic, half listening for the garage door. Sophie drifted through around 7, grabbed a granola bar, gave me a look I couldn't quite read, something between concern and embarrassment, the specific expression of a teenager who has noticed something and doesn't yet have language for it. Owen was upstairs, headphones on, blissfully elsewhere. At 9:40, Rachel's car pulled in. She came through the door smelling faintly of a perfume I didn't recognize, not hers, not mine, something sharper, more expensive, and when I mentioned, lightly, that the walk-through must have run long, she said, "You have no idea," and disappeared upstairs before I could ask a single follow-up question. I didn't push. I told myself I was giving her space. I told myself a lot of things that autumn. What I didn't tell myself, what I couldn't yet let myself think, standing in my own kitchen with my own children upstairs and my own life quietly reorganizing itself around a lie I hadn't fully admitted existed, was that somewhere in the walls of Ashford Prep, in an office 3 doors down from hers, a man named Grant Foley was already becoming a fixture in my marriage without ever once sitting at our dinner table. By the time I understood how deep it went, there would be a hospital bed, a toxicology report, a bank account with my wife's name on it and mine nowhere in sight, and a video that would circulate through half our town before I even knew it existed. But that was still months away. That night, I just climbed the stairs behind her, turned off the hallway light, and lay awake in the dark, listening to her breathe, wondering, for the first time, and not for the last, whether the woman lying 2 feet away from me was actually there at all. For a while, nothing happened. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal, it doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives like weather that's already changed by the time you notice you're cold. Our routines held their shape. I still packed Owen's lunch every morning because he refused to eat anything Rachel made, some teenage loyalty test I never understood, and Sophie still commandeered the car twice a week for what she called just driving around, which I suspected, correctly, involved a boy named Caleb. Rachel left early, came home late, and somewhere in between existed a version of my wife I was only catching in glimpses, distracted at dinner, her fork moving food around a plate she wasn't eating, her phone face down on the table for the first time in the 11 years I'd known her to leave it face up. Face down. I noticed. I didn't ask. I didn't ask, not because I didn't want to know, but because I was afraid of the answer, and a man who has built his entire adult identity around being the reasonable one, the steady one, the one who doesn't overreact, does not easily give himself permission to become a man who checks his wife's phone. Instead I threw myself into the smaller, safer griefs available to me. I reorganized my classroom. I started running again, 3 miles most mornings before the kids woke, and told myself it was about my knees, not about needing somewhere to put the low static hum that had taken up residence behind my sternum. One Tuesday in October, Sophie came home from school and said, offhand, dropping her backpack by the door, "Mrs. Foley was crying in the parking lot today." Like, really crying. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't even fully register the name. It would be weeks before I understood that the woman crying in that parking lot was Grant Foley's wife, and that whatever she already knew, I was still years, no, months, though it felt like years, from finding out. That was the first time I truly started to doubt, though I didn't know yet what I was doubting. I just knew that something in the ordinary texture of our life had gone slightly wrong, the way a familiar song sounds wrong in a key change you can't quite name. Rachel's late nights became a fixture. Accreditation season, she said, and it wasn't even a lie. Ashford Prep really was in the middle of a review cycle, a fact I would later understand she'd used the way a magician uses a scarf, real and irrelevant at the same time, drawing the eye towards something true so you wouldn't look at what was actually happening underneath it. I noticed she'd started closing the bathroom door to take calls. I noticed she flinched, actually flinched, a small full-body startle, when I walked into the kitchen once while she was texting, and how quickly the phone disappeared into her cardigan pocket, how her explanation, just Nora, being dramatic about her divorce again, arrived a half-second too fast, too smooth, the kind of answer that's been rehearsed rather than remembered. I let it go. That's my confession, the one I have to make about myself before I can fairly make any about her. I let almost all of it go. I told myself I trusted her. What I actually did was choose not to look, because looking would have required doing something about what I found, and some quiet, cowardly part of me understood that once I started pulling that thread, the whole sweater came apart. I want to pause here, because I think some of you already know this feeling. The one where you keep finding reasons not to look too closely. Not because you're stupid. Not because you don't already half know. Because you're not ready yet for the version of your life that exists on the other side of knowing. Late November, Owen had a science fair project, a unit on chemical reactions he'd been building for weeks, badgering both of us for supplies. I remember the night before it was due, Rachel promised she'd help him finish the poster board, and then didn't come home until after he'd gone to bed, defeated, having finished it alone at the kitchen table with me handing him markers and saying the wrong encouraging things. When she finally came in, she found the two of us still up, and something crossed her face, not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. Something closer to relief that she'd missed it. I filed that away too. The pile was getting taller than I wanted to admit. She told me, much later, what those weeks had actually been like on her end. I didn't plan for it to become this. That's the first thing I'd tell myself, over and over, in the car on my way to see him. It started small, Grant asking my opinion on a budget line, staying late to go over accreditation binders neither of us wanted to look at, and one night, laughing so hard about something stupid that I forgot, for maybe 20 minutes, that I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I told myself it was nothing. Just someone who saw me, actually saw me, instead of looking past me toward the kids or the schedule or the next thing that needed managing. I told myself I deserved 20 minutes of feeling like a person and not a role. I didn't let myself think past that. I was very good, that whole fall, at not letting myself think past anything. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. By early December, the signs had stopped being small. She'd started working out more, buying clothes I didn't recognize, taking calls in the car with the garage door already half closed behind her. I noticed all of it. I diagnosed none of it. I was, by then, a man actively constructing a version of reality he could live inside, one convenient explanation at a time. December brought the first thing I couldn't explain away, and it didn't come from Rachel at all. It came from Judith, no, from Nora Bishop, my closest friend since law school introduced us at a mutual colleague's dinner party a decade earlier, a family lawyer with the particular gift of saying exactly what she means without ever raising her voice. We were having our usual Thursday coffee, a standing ritual that had survived marriages, moves, and one memorable custody case Nora had talked me through when my own brother was going through his divorce. She asked, casually, stirring her coffee, "How's Rachel's accreditation thing going?" "Feels like it's been going forever." "It has been going forever," I said. "I think it wraps up before the holidays." Nora's face did something small and careful. "Ethan, Ashford's accreditation review closed in October. I know because my niece's kindergarten teacher mentioned it at pickup. They passed with commendations." I sat with that for a long moment, watching the steam rise off my coffee, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold. I remember thinking, with a kind of detached clarity that surprised me, so that's a lie. Not a misunderstanding. Not a scheduling confusion. A lie, constructed and maintained, that I had been living inside for over a month without noticing the walls. Something tightened in my chest in that moment, a physical sensation I can still summon if I think about it too directly, a fist closing slowly around something that used to sit easy in my body. I didn't confront her that night. I told myself I needed more information before I said anything, which was true, but underneath the reasonable version of that decision was a smaller, more honest one. I was terrified. Not of being wrong. Of being right. That was my blind spot, the one that had been running under everything since October. I trusted the version of Rachel I'd built over 11 years more than I trusted my own eyes in the present moment. I kept assuming stress, exhaustion, the ordinary erosion of a marriage under the weight of 2 careers and 2 teenagers, because the alternative required me to rewrite everything I thought I knew about the person I'd built a life with. The days that followed blurred into a strange, low-grade surveillance I never would have described that way at the time. I noticed she'd started keeping her phone on silent, face down, charging on her side of the bed instead of the kitchen counter where it had lived for years. I noticed a receipt in her coat pocket for a hotel bar downtown, dated the night of the accreditation walkthrough, that had ended, per Nora, 6 weeks earlier. I noticed she'd started saying "we" when she talked about school decisions in a way that used to mean her and the headmaster, and now, I began to suspect, meant something else entirely. I called it a coincidence, once, that receipt. I wouldn't call it that now. Then came the night in mid-December that changed the register of everything. I'd taken Owen to a friend's house and swung by the pharmacy on the way home, and when I walked back in, unexpectedly early, I found Rachel in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, laughing, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind I hadn't heard directed at me in months, and the moment she saw me in the doorway, the laugh cut off mid-breath like someone had thrown a switch. "I have to go," she said into the phone, too quickly, and hung up without a goodbye. "Who was that?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Grant. From work. We're finalizing the spring budget." She said it lightly, already turning toward the fridge, already changing the subject to whether we had enough milk for the morning. I let it go again. I want to be honest about how many times I let it go, because I think that's the part of this story people skip past when they tell it, not the betrayal itself, but the long, quiet complicity of choosing, again and again, not to ask the question sitting right in front of you. I didn't ask because I was afraid of the answer. I smiled, even though inside I wanted to ask 100 questions. That became a kind of pattern I didn't recognize as a pattern until much later. I was becoming fluent in a language of avoidance, and Rachel, I would eventually understand, had become fluent in a matching language of concealment, and together, without ever discussing it, We had built an entire architecture designed to keep the truth exactly as far away as it needed to be for both of us to keep sleeping in the same bed. It was around this time that Owen mentioned, unprompted, over dinner, that Mr. Foley had been at Sophie's fall showcase, standing near the back with Rachel, the two of them talking quietly through most of the second act. Sophie, 16 and far more perceptive than I'd given her credit for, went very quiet at that, staring at her plate, and later that night, when I checked on her before bed, she said, without looking at me, "Dad, is everything okay with you and Mom?" I told her yes. I told my own daughter yes, because I still didn't have the courage to tell her, or myself, anything else. The week before winter break, everything accelerated in a way I couldn't have predicted and, looking back, couldn't have stopped. It started with the migraine. I'd had a headache building since lunch, sharp behind my left eye, and by the time I got home I felt genuinely, frighteningly wrong, dizzy, my heart doing something erratic in my chest, a metallic taste climbing the back of my throat. Rachel was home for once, and to her credit, she didn't hesitate. She got me into the car and drove me to Cedarview General herself, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel, asking me over and over if I was okay in a voice I hadn't heard from her in months, raw, unguarded, actually present. The ER ran a full panel. What came back surprised everyone, including the attending physician: trace levels of a synthetic stimulant compound in my system, the kind used, a nurse explained gently, in certain unregulated pre-workout supplements, not enough to be dangerous on its own, but enough, combined with dehydration and stress, to trigger exactly the kind of cardiac scare I just had. I didn't take supplements. I told the nurse that, confused, and she asked, carefully, whether I might have been exposed some other way, shared drinkware, contaminated food, something in my environment. I didn't think anything of it that night. I was too relieved to be alive, too exhausted, too grateful for the strange tenderness Rachel showed me in the hospital room, holding my hand, telling me she loved me in a voice that, for one dangerous hour, made me want to believe none of the last 2 months had happened at all. It was Nora who put it together, 3 days later, when I mentioned the toxicology results over coffee, mostly as a strange footnote to a scary night. Her face changed. "Ethan," she said slowly, "Ashford had a supplement scandal 2 years ago. One of the coaches was selling some gray market stimulant blend to athletes. It got quietly shut down, but Grant Foley ran procurement for the athletics department back then. It's the same compound family." I sat with that. I didn't understand yet how it connected to me. I wasn't an athlete, I didn't take supplements, I had no reason to have that compound anywhere near my system, but something in me had already started assembling a shape I wasn't ready to look at directly. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever had your body figure something out before your mind would let you, you know exactly the strange, sick clarity of that moment, the sense that some part of you already knows, and is simply waiting, patiently, cruelly, for the rest of you to catch up. The answer, when it came, was almost absurdly small. Rachel had started bringing home a protein shake mix from school, something Grant had given her, she said, from a wellness thing the athletics department was doing, and she'd been making us both smoothies with it some mornings, a small domestic gesture I'd taken, at the time, as a sign things might be softening between us. The lab, when Nora quietly had a contact test the container Rachel had left on the counter, confirmed it, the same compound family, present in a concentration that explained exactly what had put me in that hospital bed. I don't think Rachel meant to poison me. I want to be fair here, because fairness is something I promised myself I'd hold on to through all of this, even when it was the last thing I wanted to extend. I believe, to this day, that what happened was carelessness born of distraction, a woman living 2 lives, handling supplements from a man she was sleeping with, not paying close enough attention to what she was pouring into her husband's smoothie because her attention had been elsewhere for months. But carelessness born of an affair is still a consequence of that affair, and I had to sit with the fact that my own body had been quietly, invisibly harmed by the fallout of a secret I hadn't yet been allowed to know I was carrying. That was the moment I understood I wasn't going to wait for her to tell me anything. I was going to find out for myself. I called Nora that same afternoon, and for the first time, I said the whole thing out loud, the whisper at 2 a.m., the accreditation lie, the receipt, Grant Foley's name attached to something in the hospital toxicology, all of it, laid out on her kitchen table like evidence in a trial I hadn't yet decided to bring. Nora didn't flinch. She'd represented enough families to know exactly what this pattern looked like from the outside. "I have a contact on the accreditation board," she said carefully. "If there's something happening at that school beyond what's happening in your marriage, we can find out quietly, without tipping anyone off." What that discreet inquiry turned up, over the following 2 weeks, was worse than either of us expected. Grant Foley, it turned out, had a history, a prior complaint at his last school, quietly settled, involving inappropriate relationships with subordinate staff. And buried in Ashford's own financial records, flagged almost by accident during the accreditation review Rachel had lied about still being underway, was a discrepancy. Funds diverted from a discretionary faculty development account into something called Redbridge Strategies LLC, a shell entity registered, when Nora ran it down, to an address that turned out to be a small rented mailbox 2 towns over. The signature authorizing those transfers belonged to Rachel. I want to be honest about the moment I saw that document. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something colder and stranger, a kind of vertigo, the ground of my entire adult life tilting slowly underneath me. I understood I wasn't dealing with a marriage that had drifted. I was dealing with a marriage that had, at some point I couldn't precisely locate, been quietly and deliberately hollowed out from the inside, while I stood in the kitchen every morning packing my son's lunch, believing I still understood the shape of my own life. She told me, much later, what she'd been thinking during those weeks, when the accreditation review turned up the discrepancy and she realized how close it all was to unraveling. I remember sitting in my car in the school parking lot after Grant told me the board might be asking questions about the LLC, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't get the key into the ignition. I kept thinking, this is it, this is the last time, I'll fix the account, I'll end things with Grant, I'll be the person I used to be before any of this started, and some small, cold part of me knew even as I thought it that I'd told myself that same lie a dozen times already and never once meant it enough to act on it. That's what she told me. I still had no idea, sitting at my own kitchen table 2 nights later, staring at bank statements with her signature on them, that she'd already been sitting in a parking lot somewhere, terrified, telling herself the exact same lie I was about to catch her in. By the time winter break arrived, I had what I needed, not everything, not yet, but enough. A pattern of deception stretching back at least 4 months. A financial trail. A hospital record connecting Grant Foley's supplements to my own body. And underneath all of it, the accumulated weight of every small moment I'd let go, every question I hadn't asked, every night I'd told myself a version of events I knew, somewhere underneath, wasn't quite true. I understood, sitting alone in my classroom the last afternoon before break, grading papers I couldn't concentrate on, that I wasn't afraid of losing her anymore. I was afraid of continuing to lose myself, one avoided conversation at a time, in a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered except the paperwork. I chose to confront her on a Saturday, 3 days into winter break, after Sophie had left for a sleepover and Owen was absorbed in a video game upstairs with headphones on. I wanted privacy. I wanted, more than that, control, over the moment, over my own voice, over whatever version of myself would exist on the other side of the next hour. Rachel was in the kitchen, unloading groceries, when I set the folder on the counter between us. Bank statements. The toxicology report. A printed email exchange Nora's contact had surfaced between Rachel and Grant, careless enough in its phrasing that no interpretation was required. She looked at it for a long moment before she looked at me. "Where did you get this?" she said. Not a question. A demand, flat and immediate, the first line of defense going up before anything else could happen. Rachel. Redbridge Strategies. Grant Supplements. Any of it, tell me it's not what it looks like. She started, predictably, with denial. "It's not what you think, the account is for something else, I can explain the LLC," but her voice was already fraying at the edges, and I watched something in her posture shift, the careful architecture of the last 4 months beginning, visibly, to buckle. She moved from denial into something angrier, sharper. "You've been going through my things?" Having someone investigate me? An attempt, I understood even as it happened, to make my discovery the crime instead of her deception, the oldest sleight of hand in the book. I didn't go through anything, I said, keeping my voice level though my hands weren't. I put together what was in front of me. What I've been putting together for months, Rachel, while you told me it was accreditation season. That was when it broke. Not gradually, all at once, the way a dam doesn't crack slowly but simply gives, all its pressure released in a single moment. She sat down hard at the kitchen table, put both hands over her face, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of its earlier sharpness left in it. "Okay," she said. "Okay. You want to know how it started?" She finally spoke. This is what she told me. It started in September, at a budget meeting that ran late. Grant made a joke about how neither of us had eaten, and he had granola bars in his desk, and we just sat there, eating stale granola bars, laughing about nothing, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I felt like a person instead of a job title. I told myself that was all it was. One late night, one conversation, nothing that mattered. The first time he kissed me, in the parking garage in October, I told myself it was a mistake I'd never repeat. That's what you tell yourself, in the moment, so you can survive being the person who just did that. But I did repeat it. I kept finding reasons, a late meeting, a school trip, a call I could take with the door closed, and every time, I told myself it was the last time, right up until it wasn't. The account, I told myself it was temporary, that I'd move the money back before anyone noticed, that it wasn't stealing if I meant to fix it. I don't think I ever actually believed that. I think I just needed something to tell myself so I could keep going. I was so afraid of being caught that I started checking my phone 40 times a day, rehearsing explanations for things nobody had even asked about yet. And the shame, Ethan, I couldn't look at the drawings on the refrigerator. Owen's science project, the one I promised to help with and didn't. I sat in my car outside a hotel that night and cried so hard I couldn't drive, because some part of me knew exactly what I was choosing over my own son, and I did it anyway. I tried to stop, once, in November. I told Grant it was over, and I meant it, for maybe 4 days. Then the accreditation review flagged the account, and I panicked, and he was the only person who knew enough to help me cover it, and I let that fear pull me right back in. I don't have a version of this where I come out looking like anything other than what I am. I just need you to know it wasn't nothing to me. It was everything wrong, and I chose it anyway, over and over, and I don't know how to make that make sense to you, because it doesn't make sense to me either. That's what she told me. I sat across from her at the table where we'd eaten 10,000 meals as a family, and I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, something closer to mourning, the specific, total mourning of realizing the person you built a life with was, for months, building an entirely separate one you were never invited into. I understood then that I hadn't been maintaining a marriage that autumn. I'd been maintaining the appearance of one, smiling through dinners, packing lunches, telling my daughter everything was fine, and telling myself that was the same thing as the real thing. It wasn't. It had never been the same thing. Sophie came home from her sleepover early, sensing something through whatever silent frequency teenagers use to detect a house in crisis, and found us still at the table, the folder still between us. She looked at her mother's tear-streaked face, at my carefully controlled one, and her reaction surprised me, not the shock I expected, but something colder, older. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to be the one who said it first." She went upstairs without another word, and it would be days before she spoke to either of us about it again, processing it in the particular silent, watchful way that had always been hers. Owen, when he came down later that evening, asked only one question, small and devastating in its simplicity: "Are you guys getting divorced?" I didn't lie to him. I told him I didn't know yet, which was, that night, still technically true. Rachel asked, before I left the kitchen, whether there was any version of this we could survive. She mentioned therapy. She used the word forgiveness in a voice so small I almost didn't recognize it as hers. I told her I needed time. I didn't tell her, that night, what I already suspected, that some doors, once you've stood on the other side of them and seen clearly what's there, don't close back into the shape they used to be. The months that followed moved with a strange, procedural quietness after the noise of that confrontation. Nora handled the divorce filing with the same careful precision she'd brought to uncovering everything that led to it. The financial fraud, once the accreditation board's own investigation caught up to what Nora's contact had already found, ended Rachel's career at Ashford Prep entirely. She was suspended within 2 weeks and formally terminated by spring, her name quietly and then not so quietly attached to the kind of scandal that doesn't stay contained to a single school for long. Grant Foley was let go the same week. Word reached me, through channels I didn't go looking for, that his own marriage hadn't survived the fallout either, and that he'd left the district altogether by summer, his professional reputation trailing behind him wherever he went next. There was, briefly, a video. Someone, a student or a parent, had recorded a heated exchange between Rachel and the headmaster in a school hallway during the investigation, Rachel's composure finally cracking in public the way it had in our kitchen in private, and it made its way onto social media before anyone could stop it, circulating through our town's group chats and comment sections with the particular cruelty that public humiliation online always carries. I didn't share it. I didn't need to. It existed on its own, doing its own damage, and I found I took no satisfaction in watching it happen, only a tired, sad recognition that some consequences arrive whether or not you ask for them. Rachel asked for reconciliation once more, in March, over coffee Nora had advised me to have in a public place. She'd started therapy. She talked about wanting to be a different person, a better mother, someone worth trusting again. I believed she meant it, in the moment she said it. I also understood, with a clarity that surprised me with how little it hurt, that meaning it and having earned it were two different things, and that I was no longer willing to be the proving ground for the second one. I told her no. Gently, but without room for negotiation. Custody worked out largely in my favor, not through any vindictiveness on my part, but because the pattern of the previous year, laid out plainly in Nora's filings, made clear who had actually shown up for Sophie and Owen during the months that mattered most. Rachel kept regular visitation. The kids, especially Sophie, needed time before that relationship found any kind of new, honest footing, but by summer, something had begun, slowly, to stabilize. I called it a coincidence once, that receipt from the hotel bar. I wouldn't call it that now, I'd call it the first thread of a rope that, pulled hard enough, unraveled an entire life I thought I understood. I think about that a lot, actually, how much of what happened was contained, in miniature, in that one small lie about accreditation. Every red flag after it was just an echo of the same shape, over and over, and I kept mistaking the echo for something new each time instead of recognizing the pattern for what it was. I met Vivian in April, of all unremarkable places, in the faculty lounge over a broken coffee machine neither of us could figure out how to fix. She taught science down the hall from my classroom, and there was nothing dramatic about how it started, just an ease, a directness, a way of looking at me that didn't require me to perform anything. I wasn't looking for it. I think that's part of why it worked. By early summer, Ashford's headmaster position for the following academic year, his own, unrelated to any of the scandal, had opened up, and to my genuine surprise, my own principal recommended me for a leadership track position at our district, a role I would never have pursued during the version of my life where I spent most of my energy managing a marriage I didn't fully understand. Sophie's science teacher told me, at the end of the year, that her final project, on chemical reactions, the same subject Owen had struggled through alone at our kitchen table the year before, included a dedication in the acknowledgments, to my dad, for showing up even when it was hard. I keep that page in my desk drawer. I don't think I'll ever throw it away. I understand now that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you're ready to pay, until, eventually, it costs more not to. Owen asked me, one evening in early summer, watching me make dinner, whether I was happy. It wasn't a loaded question, just a 14-year-old straightforward curiosity. I told him yes, and meant it, and understood as I said it that it was the first time in almost a year I'd answered that question honestly without having to think about it first. The most painful detail in this story was never the affair itself, it was the accreditation lie, the small, almost forgettable fabrication that arrived months before any of the larger betrayals and quietly taught Ethan how to stop trusting his own perception. Every subsequent red flag he absorbed and rationalized was, in some sense, an echo of that first successful lie. Rachel learned, without ever consciously deciding to, that Ethan would choose comfort over confrontation, and she built an entire second life inside that learned permission. What this reveals, beyond the specifics of this particular marriage, is how betrayal rarely survives on deception alone. It survives on the willing, half-conscious cooperation of the person being deceived, who chooses not to look because looking costs more than not knowing, until the costs of not knowing finally outweigh it. Rachel's arc deserves its own honest accounting, separate from the damage she caused. Her confession reveals someone who didn't set out to destroy her family, who instead made one small choice in a moment of loneliness, and then made the same choice again and again, each repetition requiring a slightly larger self-deception to sustain, until the person capable of stopping had quietly disappeared inside the person still finding reasons to continue. This doesn't excuse what she did to Ethan's body, his trust, or his children's stability. It does explain, with more nuance than a simple villain narrative allows, how ordinary people build extraordinary betrayals one small permission at a time. The turning points that actually mattered weren't dramatic. They were Nora's offhand correction about the accreditation timeline, and the toxicology report connecting an unrelated medical scare to a supplement Rachel had unknowingly carried home from her affair. Neither was a confrontation. Both were quiet, almost accidental collisions with a truth that had been available all along, waiting for Ethan to be ready enough to see it. That's often how the truth actually arrives, not through dramatic discovery, but through small, external corrections to a story we've been telling ourselves for too long. Which raises the harder question this story leaves unanswered: how many of us are, right now, living inside a version of events we've quietly agreed not to examine too closely, not because we're being lied to, necessarily, but because some part of us has decided the truth would cost more than we're currently willing to pay. I think about that 2 a.m. whisper more than almost anything else from that whole year, not the confession, not the hospital, not even the divorce papers. Just 11 quiet words in the dark, and the version of myself who heard them and chose, for months afterward, not to ask a single question. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because I think most people reading this have their own version of that whisper, some moment where you already knew, and chose, understandably, humanly, not to look yet. If you've ever done that, ignored something because knowing felt worse than not knowing, I don't think that makes you weak. I think it makes you someone who was trying to protect a life you weren't ready to lose. The difference, I've learned, is what you do once you're finally ready to look. I'd love to know, one word, in the comments, for someone who let you down, or a moment you chose not to look too closely at something you already half knew. Thank you for sitting with this one all the way to the end. Some stories take longer to tell than others, and this was one I needed more than 35 minutes to finally say out loud.